Again, thank you all for joining today. I wish I could be there in person, but as I was saying earlier, when I looked out the window this morning and saw the rain and snow, I was kind of happy to just to be able to do this from home. It's Friday lunchtime, and we're talking about a pretty serious topic, and our Canadian cities facing a fiscal crisis. So it's great that you have all joined us. What I want to do in the half hour or so that I have is four things. I think if we want to know if Canadian cities are facing a fiscal crisis, I think we need to start with, were they facing a fiscal crisis before COVID-19? What has been the impact of COVID-19 on municipal finance? And are they facing a crisis now being 2020, 2021, and what does the future look like? And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't have something to say about where we go from here or what needs to be done. So were municipalities fiscally healthy before COVID-19? And we at the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance have done a lot of work on this question, both in Toronto and Ontario municipalities, but also municipalities across Canada. And there are a number of ways to measure fiscal health, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but just mention a few. One of the things we look at is the operating budgets of municipalities. Are they balancing their budgets? Do their revenues cover their expenditures? Well, municipalities in Canada, as you know, are governed by provincial legislation, but in all provinces in Canada, municipalities are required to not budget for an operating deficit. In other words, when they put their operating budgets together, by law, they are required to go for a balanced budget. And of course, we saw before COVID-19 for 2020, municipalities had, budgeted for balanced budgets, but things happened. So if that's a measure of fiscal health, they're fiscally healthy because they balance their operating budgets, but they have to. Municipalities are allowed to borrow to make capital expenditures for infrastructure, for example. But again, each province has limits on how much they can borrow. Sometimes it's something like your debt charges can't exceed 25% of your own source revenues, those kinds of rules. And when we look across Canada, by and large, municipalities are borrowing within their provincial limits. Sometimes they're well below those limits. When we look at what's happened to spending over the last 10 years, we find that expenditures aren't increasing that rapidly. They are at about the rate of inflation. Again, I'm talking on average. I'm not talking every municipality, but generally they're increasing at about the rate of inflation. And when we look at property taxes per capita, we're finding they're increasing on average at less than the rate of inflation. So property taxes are not skyrocketing in any sense. So when we look at these kinds of measures and other similar measures, we find that municipalities are fiscally quite healthy. But, big but at the end of this slide, that's not the whole story. What we have seen is that municipalities are able to balance their budgets. They're able to keep property taxes down, but it is at the expense of deteriorating services and infrastructure. So, I don't have to tell you all the stories about the, bridges collapsing and roads needing repair and transit state of good repair not being terrific and all of the other problems with infrastructure and services. So what we often say is that the fiscal health has been achieved at the expense of the overall health of municipalities. And when we look at what's happening in the future, we see further problems for municipalities, largely because of the changing employment landscape or the changing nature of work. So, we have seen over the years a move from manufacturing to a service economy with emphasis on knowledge-based jobs. We've seen manufacturing plants being replaced by warehouses and distribution centers, so all of these online services can deliver things to our homes. Particularly now with COVID-19, we're seeing more people working from home, but there was a bit of a trend to that even before COVID-19. So traditional office spaces have become obsolete. And we've certainly seen a reduced demand for retail spaces because of online shopping. Again, this was happening before COVID-19, but it's being exacerbated by the pandemic. And so these are going to have effects on municipalities. They're definitely going to affect their business property tax base. And as you know, one of the main sources of revenue for municipalities in Canada is the property tax, and they get a lot of revenues out of the business property tax base. And these trends that I'm highlighting here suggest that in the future, that business tax base is going to decline and cause fiscal problems for municipalities. So are municipalities fiscally healthy going into the pandemic? On average, I would say they are, but that this fiscal health may have been achieved at the expense of their overall health. So what does the pandemic do to all of this? And it's interesting because at the very beginning of the pandemic, we were concerned about the health of individuals, and rightly so. We were then concerned about the economy, and then we started to look at things like what's happening with municipalities and municipal finance. And at the beginning, we talked about all the impacts on municipalities, as if every municipality is the same. And one of the things we know about about 3,750 municipalities in Canada is they're all different. And so the impact of COVID has been different in different municipalities, and I think that's important to note. And those differences depend on a number of things. Firstly, they depend on the fiscal health going into the pandemic, which I just talked about. It depends on what they're responsible for, what services they're delivering. It depends on where they get their money to pay for these services. It depends on the federal and provincial policies towards municipalities and the transfers they give them. And it also depends on their fiscal flexibility. So let's start with expenditure responsibilities. One of the things we were actually talking about before this presentation started was how the pandemic has shown us how important cities are to our daily lives, because they are on the front lines when it comes to providing services. In terms of COVID-19, they have been really effective in the areas of public health, emergency services, childcare for first responders, food security, social distancing on transit. These are expenditures that have definitely increased because of COVID-19. But they still are providing transit, they have roads, they're picking up the garbage and disposing of it, there's parks, there's recreation facilities, there's libraries, and cities are doing all of these things as well. And then they've had the added cost of more cleaning of municipal facilities, provision of personal protective equipment to their staff. And of course, with the increased numbers of people, and at the city also working from home, there have been some IT costs for staff working from home. And so on the expenditure side of their budgets, they have seen increases. These have been offset to some extent by some expenditure reductions. Some facilities have been closed. Libraries, for example, recreation centers have been closed. There have been cuts in professional development costs. We're not traveling these days, so there's no travel costs. There have been cuts in hiring for non-essential services. So there's a bit of an offset against these expenditure increases, but just, I think, overall expenditures have gone up. But I think the real hit for municipalities has been on the revenue side. As I mentioned, the main source of revenue to municipalities is the property tax. And I would say most municipalities have provided property tax deferrals. In other words, you get your tax bill, instead of having to pay it right away, you get 30 days or 60 days or 90 days extra to pay your property taxes. This is a temporary loss in revenues because eventually those taxes will be paid, and we're seeing that those taxes are being paid. There's a potential longer-term loss on business property taxes, and I discussed the issues before about how that business property tax base may be shrinking, and that is a permanent loss of revenues to municipalities. Of course, when you defer taxes without penalty or interest, there's the loss of that penalty and interest income. There's been a reduction in user fees for municipalities, and this is especially true for transit fares. So we know in the major cities in Canada, ridership has been down 80 to 90% during the pandemic. It's starting to come back a bit, but it's nowhere near what it was before the pandemic. And these revenues are permanently lost. They are gone. There's lower development charge revenues, but again, this is a temporary loss. One assumes that some of that development will occur later on. Provincial transfers have been steady. That's a steady source of revenue for municipalities. And in some places, we've seen land transfer taxes actually increase. The revenues have actually gone up. We've seen this in Nova Scotia in particular, where they have a deed transfer tax, and these revenues have increased. So again, the impact on the revenue side, I think, has been more significant than the impact on the expenditure side, and particularly for those municipalities that have transit systems where the transit fares have gone down. So the next issue is fiscal flexibility. How able are municipalities to absorb this stress, and what's their capacity to adjust expenditures and revenues? And again, this is a shock. Nobody was prepared for this pandemic. Budgets were done in 2020 on the basis of business as usual. So if municipalities have a lot of reserves, they can dip into those reserves without having to cut expenditures or raise taxes. If they have borrowing capacity, they can do more borrowing. If they're not at the borrowing limit, they can borrow more funds. They can defer their capital investments. So the municipalities may have planned to build some roads or improve transit or construct some parks. They can defer those. But their flexibility also depends on their diversity of revenues. So if they have a lot of different ways of raising money, if they have income taxes and sales taxes and property taxes and vehicle registration taxes, they have more flexibility because they have different taxes. But as you know, Canadian municipalities largely depend on property taxes, user fees, and revenues from the federal and provincial governments. So the next thing is what the other governments are doing. And the federal government responded in two ways so far. One is it fast-tracked the gas tax transfer for infrastructure. So the federal government provides money for infrastructure to municipalities. We call it a gas tax transfer, which is misnamed because it really doesn't have anything to do with gas tax revenues. It's just $2 billion a year adjusted by inflation every year. And they give it to municipalities twice a year, and they just gave the funding earlier this year. But then they gave $2 billion for municipalities to cover their operating deficits. And this is new because generally the federal government gives money to municipalities for capital purposes, not operating. They also added $1.8 billion for transit that has to be matched 50-50 with the provinces. So that's what the federal government has done. Provincial governments have done a number of different things. One of the things they've done is change the borrowing rules. So I told you that municipalities could borrow for capital expenditures, and there are limits to that. They can also borrow while they're waiting for property tax revenues to come in, but there are restrictions on how much they can borrow and when they have to pay it back. So some provinces like British Columbia changed the borrowing rules to allow municipalities to borrow more to cover their operating deficit, waiting for taxes to come in, and for a longer period of time. The province of Nova Scotia is providing operating loans for municipalities, but keep in mind that both of these things, changing the borrowing rules and operating loans, are temporary measures because the municipalities have to pay back this money in both cases. And they're going to have to pay it back in 2021 or 2022. And as we'll discuss shortly, it's not clear those years are going to be better for municipalities than the current time period. Some have provided grants and subsidies. Others have deferred payment or reduced their provincial property taxes. So in some provinces, the provincial government also levies a property tax. They do that in Ontario, which covers some of the costs of education. And province has reduced those education property taxes in response to COVID-19 to help municipalities. Well, what have municipalities done? Well, again, it's different in different places. It's not a good idea to talk about all municipalities as if they're the same. So some have taken advantage of these borrowing rules that have let them borrow more, and they have increased their short-term borrowing. Many have dipped into their capital reserves. Others have deferred capital programs. And some have actually cut programs and staff. Dipping into capital reserves, deferring capital programs, again, that's getting us through 2020. But these were capital reserves that were there for a reason. These capital programs were there for a reason. And so in the long run, this is going to cause problems for municipalities. So, that's where we are now. Municipalities are getting by borrowing more, by cutting some of their capital programs, and in some cases, redeploying or letting go staff. But what's going to happen next year and the year after? And there's a lot of uncertainty going forward in the long run. Will people move to the suburbs or rural areas? I've been on so many webinars in the last few days talking about, are people going to leave the city? And are people leaving the city? And who's leaving the city? And would they have left if it weren't for COVID? And what's going to happen in the future? Are people going to continue to work from home? These kinds of decisions will affect municipal finances. It will affect the amount of property taxes we can collect. It will affect development charge revenues. It will affect the infrastructure spending that we have to make. Another big question mark, will riders get back on public transit? We know that there has been somewhat of a revival on public transit, but it's nowhere near what it was before. Will people get into their cars? Will we see a lot more automobile use? What about the transformation we're seeing to digital services? Is that going to expand? Will more municipal services be delivered digitally? What about healthcare, education, shopping, the courts, the arts? Is this going to expand? I've been watching theater and musical concerts on Zoom. It's a whole new world. Will that continue? Or are we going to want to go back to the theaters and the musical concerts? I know I do. What's going to happen to real estate prices? And again, that is going to affect the property tax base. We're seeing in Toronto that house prices have held, condominium prices have gone down. How does that affect property taxes? And will the business closure and storefront vacancies increase? And if so, how will the commercial property tax be affected? And for those of you who work in the property tax field or know a bit about property taxes, we tax businesses a lot more than we tax residential properties in Toronto, but in cities across Canada and indeed around the world. And so that funding source is very important to municipalities. And is it going to continue to be there? But let's not be totally negative, because we can look at the COVID-19 crisis as an opportunity to do things better. We're talking about building back better, whether it's President-elect Biden in the States or some of us here talking about building back better. Can we build back green? We've started to rethink transportation. We've seen street widened bike lanes, rapid bus lanes. Things that we've been talking about, but it's taken so long to get done, seem to be happening much more quickly. I put here, is it time for road tolls? Can we make some of the serious changes we've been talking about for such a long time? We seem to be more nimble during the crisis than we have been the rest of the time. If we're going to build back, can we build back green? Addressing inequality. I don't have to tell this audience that one of the things that this pandemic has shown is how inequality has been exacerbated by the pandemic. And we've talked about inequality for such a long time. We do Gini coefficients and numbers and curves, but it's much more visible to us now when we see frontline workers who have to go to work, who are living in multifamily homes, who are on the buses, on crowded buses. I think it's much more visible to us now. And can we address this by providing more affordable housing, more childcare spaces? Should we be providing reduced fares on transit for low-income individuals? There is an opportunity here when people see the problems more vividly to make a difference. Are we going to go digital? We've seen a lot of digital transformation in financial operations of municipalities. I'm on calls all the time with people from municipalities across Canada, and they say, well, we've gone paperless as a result of COVID. We've gone digital, and we're doing our finances digitally. We're making a lot less mistakes, and that we can do it much faster, and we can focus on other things rather than dealing with all of these numbers. So there are opportunities to do things better, to build back better. So where does that take us? What can we do? What needs to be done? And I'm referring here to three studies that we've been involved in. The first was with Ontario 360, called In It Together, Clarifying Provincial Municipal Responsibilities in Ontario. So this is, coming back to the question of who does what and how do we pay for it. And Brian in the introduction said I was on the Who Does What panel in 1996. This is not a new topic by any means, but it definitely is one that needs to be revisited. And the other two papers, one by Thomas Hatchard, who's at the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance, and one by Neil Bradford, who wrote a paper for us. He's at Western University. We need to look at trilateral collaboration among all three orders of government: federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal. And one of the things that's happened during COVID-19 is we've seen a lot of collaboration. We've seen the federal government talking to municipalities. Is there somehow that we can expand on this collaboration and the goodwill that has resulted? So as I said, it's time to revisit who does what. I think COVID-19, as I've said so many times already, has shown that municipalities are on the front lines when it comes to delivering services. But it has also shown that they don't have sufficient resources to deliver those services. So the federal and provincial governments have come to the rescue by providing funding, and I talked about some of the funding that they have provided. I guess the first question is it enough, and will it continue? But is it really what's needed? Does it really strengthen the fiscal health of municipalities in the long run? Can municipalities keep going back to the federal and provincial governments every year begging for money? Is that the right model? And as those of you who know me know, for years I've been saying that municipalities need much more local fiscal autonomy so that they can determine themselves how to pay for things and be responsible and accountable for what they're doing. So it is time to clarify provincial municipal responsibilities. Again, it's not that it hasn't been done before, but we need to look at who does what and how to pay for it. And so in that study, the first one that was on this, one of the earlier slides on clarifying responsibilities, we had this chart which says who funds what. And you can see at the top, fire is 100% financed by municipalities, parks and recreation 98%, libraries and culture 97%. But when you get down to the bottom row, and you're looking at ambulance, long-term care, public health, social assistance, and childcare, you see, a lot of provincial and municipal funding going into those areas. In other words, it's pretty entangled. Not just the money, which is what this chart's about, but the regulations and the delivery are all very much entangled. And so in that report, we made a number of recommendations. And This report came out before the pandemic, before we even knew there was going to be a pandemic. And we said, if we're going to sort out who does what, we need to do it collaboratively. It can't be the old way of the province comes and tells us who does what. It has to be collaborative. The province and municipalities have to be at the table. Follow the pay for say principle and avoid unfunded mandates. That just means the province shouldn't be saying, you do this, follow these rules, but we're not going to pay for it, or we're going to change the rules, but you've got to do it with your own money. We have to look at local revenue capacity. If we're going to give responsibilities to municipalities, they have to be able to pay for them. So we have to do the who does what and the how to pay for it. We need to respect local and regional differences. So some municipalities are going to be quite able to provide services. In the earlier discussion I had, I said some are fiscally healthy, some are not. We need to look forward, not backward. It's not what we did the last 10 years that we need to look at, but what we're going to be doing the next 10 years. And strangely enough, as I said, we did this study before the pandemic, but we said the exercise of who does what really should start with health and social services, because those really are the most entangled. And lastly, we need to think about trilateral collaboration. We need to formalize the trilateral relations that have been part of the funding agreements in response to COVID-19. Municipalities need to be directly involved in negotiations and agreements on issues that affect them, things like infrastructure, immigration, and public health. And, it's an old expression, but we need to bring it back. Municipalities need to have a seat at the table. There was another study that came out from Ontario 360 at the Monk School at U of T by Jonah Goldberg and Sean Spear on fiscal federalism. And they had an interesting comparison in it of Toronto, the city of Toronto, and the province of Prince Edward Island. City of Toronto, population 2.7 million. Population of the province of PEI, 142,900. Toronto's way bigger in terms of population. Operating budget of the City of Toronto, 13.5 billion. Operating budget of the province of PEI, 2 billion. And yet, the federal and provincial transfers that the City of Toronto gets are $893 per capita. Federal transfers to PEI are $4,320 per capita. And, as I said before, the City of Toronto gets to levy a property tax, a few other smaller taxes. PEI gets income taxes, sales taxes, fuel taxes, and the list goes on. Oh, and yes, they have a seat at the table. So I think it is definitely time to think about municipalities being involved in these trilateral agreements. And there have been agreements like this in the past. I'm not saying this is a new idea. There have been urban development agreements in cities like Winnipeg and Edmonton. We do have a history of this, but I think it needs to be stronger. So just to conclude, before the pandemic, I think Canadian cities have been in pretty good shape going into this crisis. The impact has been different in different places. So we're finding in the big cities that have major transit systems, they have been particularly hard hit. Ontario municipalities that cover some of the costs of social services, unlike in other provinces, they have been hard hit. Smaller tourist municipalities have been hit. So it's not been even across the country. But I think the pandemic has highlighted the cracks in our federal fiscal structure, and I think I've tried to highlight those. And I think it's time to consider, again, who does what and how we pay for it. And I think it's time for more trilateral collaboration. So I think I'll stop there and would be delighted to take questions. Thank you.